The gunshot shattered the winter silence like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Ethan Caldwell's head snapped up his hand, dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip, with the practiced instinct of a man who had survived by being faster than those who wanted him dead. His breath hung in the frigid air as his eyes swept across the tree line, muscles coiled and ready. A second shot cracked through the stillness, closer this time. Without hesitation, Ethan slid his revolver free, ducking behind the woodpile he'd been stacking moments before. The war had been over for 7 years, but in the Wyoming wilderness, danger never truly disappeared. It just wore different faces. Movement caught his eye. A figure burst from the pines, stumbling across the snow-covered clearing toward his cabin. A woman small and dark against the white expanse, a trail of crimson droplets marking her path like macabre breadcrumbs. Behind her, 3 riders emerged from the forest, rifles raised. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't his fight. He had claimed this isolated patch of wilderness precisely to avoid other people's battles. Yet, as the woman staggered forward, her eyes found his across the yard, wide, desperate, and filled with a defiance that struck something forgotten inside him. He raised his Colt and fired a warning shot over the riders' heads. They pulled their horses up short, one shouting words lost to the wind. Ethan fired again, deliberately closer, and watched as they conferred briefly before retreating into the trees. Not gone, he knew, just regrouping. The woman collapsed onto the snow yards from his porch, one hand clutching a leather pouch, the other wrapped around something bundled in faded cloth. Blood stained the snow beneath her bright against the pristine white. Ethan approached cautiously, rifle now in hand, gaze never leaving the tree line. "Don't move," he said, the words rough from disuse. She was Apache. The high cheekbones, the copper skin, the long black hair now matted with blood and sweat told him that much. Young, perhaps early 20s, with a torn dress and moccasins worn nearly through. But it was her eyes that held him, dark as night, yet burning with fierce determination despite her obvious pain. Something twisted in Ethan's gut, old hatred, old grief. Apache. The same people who had ambushed his unit in a dawn mist, who had killed Thomas with arrows that made no sound until they found their mark in his best friend's chest. The woman made a small sound, pain and exhaustion mingled in her throat as more blood seeped from her side. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, holstering his weapon. 7 years of solitude had hardened him, but not enough to watch someone bleed out on his doorstep, Apache or not. He lifted her, surprised at how little she weighed, despite the fierce struggle he'd witnessed. Her body tensed at his touch before going limp. Consciousness finally surrendering to pain. The bundle in her arms shifted, revealing something bound in leather beneath the cloth. Inside his cabin, a single room with methodical organization that reflected his need for control. Ethan laid her on the bearskin rug near the stove. He set water to boil, then retrieved his field medical kit, remnants of skills he'd hoped to leave behind, along with war. As he cut away the blood-soaked fabric around her wound, the woman's eyes fluttered open, immediately alert, despite her weakness. "They come back," she said, her English broken but determined. "Probably," Ethan replied, not looking up as he examined the bullet graze along her side. Deep, but not fatal, if infection could be prevented. "You help?" The question seemed to cost her considerable effort. Ethan finally met her gaze, his expression deliberately impassive. "I'm stopping the bleeding. After that, you're on your own." She nodded once, accepting his terms without pleading or argument. Something about that quiet dignity gave him pause. As he cleaned the wound, Ethan noticed other marks on her skin, older scars across her back, where her dress had torn, the kind that came from deliberate cruelty. His jaw tightened involuntarily. "What's your name?" he asked, focusing on wrapping a clean bandage around her torso. "Nara," she replied, watching his hands with careful attention. "Who's after you, Nara?" Her eyes darted to his face, then away. "Blue-eye medicine man," she said. "He want secret." Her hand moved protectively toward the bundle she'd carried, now lying beside her. "What secret?" Ethan pressed, securing the bandage. Nara shook her head, her expression closing like a door being shut. "My people's secret. He killed for it." Ethan sat back on his heels, studying her. There was something in her defiance that reminded him of himself, the stubborn will to survive that had carried him through the war's darkest moments and the empty years that followed. "You can stay until morning," he said, finally standing. "Then you need to move on. I don't want trouble finding my door." Nara watched him as he moved away, setting up a pallet for himself near the door, as far from her as the small cabin allowed. He could feel her eyes following his every movement as he cleaned his rifle, checked the windows, and barred the door, the nightly ritual that helped quiet the vigilance burned into him by years of combat. That night, Ethan slept with his rifle across his chest, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in his carefully constructed solitude. Morning brought steel-gray skies and a heaviness in the air that promised more snow. Ethan rose before dawn, as was his habit, to find Nara already awake, sitting up against the wall. Her face was pale but composed, showing no sign of the pain she must have felt. "Storm coming," she said quietly, nodding toward the window where the first flakes had begun to fall. Ethan grunted in acknowledgement, moving to stoke the fire. "Makes your leaving difficult." "I go anyway," she said, attempting to stand, but faltering as her wound protested. Despite himself, Ethan moved to steady her, catching her arm before she could fall. The contact was brief but electric, the first time he had touched another human being with anything approaching gentleness in years. "Foolish," he said more roughly than he intended. "You'll freeze to death before you get 5 miles." "Better freeze than what Blue-Eye do," Nara replied, her dark eyes meeting his with unflinching directness. Something in her gaze, the absolute certainty of what awaited her if captured, made Ethan hesitate. He released her arm and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "The storm will last at least 2 days," he said finally. "You can stay until it passes. Then you go." Nara studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his trustworthiness against whatever danger she fled. Finally, she nodded once. 2 days. Then I go." The agreement reached, Ethan set about preparing a sparse breakfast: coffee, hardtack, and dried venison. They ate in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken questions and half-formed judgments. "Your wound needs changing," Ethan said when they'd finished. "Let me see it." Nara hesitated, then turned to allow him access to her side. As he unwrapped the bandage, Ethan found himself noticing details he'd missed in the urgency of the previous night: the small beaded bracelet at her wrist, the intricate pattern woven into her dress, the way her hair, even matted with dried blood, showed evidence of careful braiding. The wound looked clean, with no sign of the infection he'd feared. Still, he applied a fresh poultice and bandage, his movements clinical but careful. "You know medicine," Nara observed, watching his hands. "Field training," Ethan replied shortly. "During the war." "War against my people?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Ethan's hands stilled for a moment. "Among others." Nara absorbed this with a thoughtful nod. "Many wars, too many." The simple truth of her statement caught Ethan off guard. He had expected hatred or at least resentment, not this quiet acknowledgement of shared tragedy. "Yes," he agreed, finally securing the bandage. "Too many." Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, curtaining the windows with white. Inside, two enemies by circumstance found themselves in an uneasy truce, forced together by storm and circumstance. The day passed slowly, marked by the muffled howl of wind against the cabin walls and the occasional crack of settling wood in the stove. Ethan kept busy with small tasks, mending a torn shirt, cleaning his weapons, checking his supplies, all while maintaining a careful distance from his unexpected guest. Nara rested near the fire, her eyes often closed, though Ethan suspected she wasn't truly sleeping. The bundle she'd carried remained always within her reach, protected with the vigilance of a mother guarding her child. As evening approached and the storm's fury increased, Ethan found his curiosity about that bundle growing. What secret could be valuable enough for men to hunt a lone woman through winter wilderness? What could drive her to flee with wounds that should have laid her flat? When Nara finally did sleep, exhaustion overcoming her wariness, Ethan moved quietly to where the bundle lay beside her. He hesitated, an unfamiliar sense of trespass giving him pause. Then carefully he lifted it and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a leather pouch, and beneath it a worn journal bound in deerskin, its pages yellowed with age. Opening it cautiously, he found meticulous sketches of plants, handwritten notes in what appeared to be Apache alongside English annotations. A medical text of some kind, filled with herbal remedies and treatments. But what caught his breath was a loose page tucked between the leaves, a page torn from a different journal altogether, the handwriting familiar in a way that made his heart stutter. Clean, precise script that he'd last seen on bandage labels and death certificates during the bloodiest days of the war. Dr. James Harrington's handwriting. "Not yours," came a quiet voice from behind him. Ethan turned to find Nara awake, watching him with those dark, penetrating eyes. No anger in her expression, just a careful wariness. "This handwriting," he said, holding up the loose page. "I know it." Nara's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "You know Blue Eye." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. Could Harrington, the surgeon who had saved his life after the Apache ambush, be the man hunting Nara? The same doctor whose skill and dedication had kept Ethan from joining Thomas in death. "I knew a doctor with this handwriting," he said carefully. "During the war." Nara pushed herself up to sitting, pain momentarily forgotten in the urgency of this revelation. "This doctor, he have red-gray hair, eyes, blue like sky, speak soft, but hands—" She paused, searching for words. "Hands, sometimes cruel." The description matched Harrington well enough, though the cruelty Nara implied sat uneasily with Ethan's memories of the man who had worked tirelessly to save wounded soldiers. "Why is he hunting you?" Ethan asked, avoiding direct confirmation. Nara's hand moved to her side where the bullet had grazed her. "He take me from village. Make me write down medicine knowledge." Her voice hardened. "When I not tell all truth, he punish." She turned slightly, showing Ethan her back where he had glimpsed the scars the night before. "He say, for science, for help all people. But he lie. He only want power of knowledge, not share." Ethan stared at the page in his hand, trying to reconcile the Harrington he remembered with the man Nara described. The doctor had been brilliant, but arrogant, dedicated, but distant, a man who viewed his patients as puzzles to solve rather than people to comfort. "How did you escape?" he asked, handing the journal back to her. "Night guard sleep," Nara said, taking the book with reverent care. "I take medicine book and run. Many days run." She met his gaze directly. "Book holds secrets of my people. Healing ways passed through many grandmothers. Not for Blue Eye to take." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding her fierce protection of the journal now. It wasn't just a book. It was her heritage, her people's knowledge, perhaps all that remained of a culture under siege. "You should get more rest," he said, finally returning to his pallet by the door. "The storm won't break until tomorrow at the earliest." Nara watched him for a moment longer, something questioning in her gaze. Then she nodded and settled back down, the journal clutched protectively against her chest. Ethan lay awake long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling as the wind howled outside. If Harrington was indeed the Blue Eye, Nara feared, where did that leave Ethan's loyalty? With the doctor who had saved his life, or with the wounded woman who had stumbled onto his doorstep? The question followed him into uneasy dreams of blood on snow, and Thomas's voice calling his name from somewhere just beyond reach. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping Ethan and Nara in the confines of the small cabin. What had begun as grudging shelter slowly transformed as Nara's strength returned. She insisted on helping with tasks, despite Ethan's gruff objections, grinding coffee beans, mending a torn shirt with tiny, precise stitches, even preparing a poultice for his old shoulder wound that eased the ache when storms approached. They spoke little at first, the silence between them gradually shifting from tense to companionable. On the 3rd evening, as they sat before the fire, sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew, Ethan found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the precise way she worked, the quiet dignity in her movements. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "When the storm breaks." Nara looked up from her bowl, studying him before answering. "Go west," she said. "Find what left of my people." "And Harrington, the Blue Eye." Her expression hardened. "Hide from him. Book too important." She hesitated, then added, "He not stop hunting. Ever." Ethan nodded, understanding the kind of obsession she described. He'd seen it during the war, men who lost their humanity in pursuit of a goal, who justified any action in service of what they believed was right. "You know what inside book?" Nara asked suddenly, watching his face closely. "Medicines. Healing plants," Ethan replied with a shrug. "I only saw a few pages." Nara shook her head slightly. "More than medicines. Books show sacred places. Waters that heal any sickness. Map to place my people protect for many generations." Understanding dawned on Ethan. That's what Harrington really wants, not just the herbal remedies. "Yes," Nara confirmed. "He hears stories of healing waters. Think make him rich famous doctor, not care who hurt to find it." The pieces fell into place in Ethan's mind. Harrington had always been ambitious, had spoken of making medical discoveries that would cement his legacy long after the war ended. If he believed the Apache held secrets to miraculous cures, he might indeed go to extreme lengths to obtain them. "I thought the war was behind me," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. "Thought I'd left all that bloodshed back east." "War never really end," Nara replied, her voice gentle despite the harshness of her words. "Just change shape, change enemies." Their eyes met across the small space, and Ethan was struck by the depth of understanding in her gaze, as though she could see through the careful walls he'd built around himself to the wounds that still festered beneath. That night Ethan woke gasping from his recurring nightmare, the ambush, Thomas, falling, the arrow protruding from his chest. But this time, a new element had woven itself into the familiar horror. Harrington standing over Thomas's body, not with a surgeon's healing intent, but with a collector's cold assessment. He sat up, heart pounding, to find Nara kneeling beside his pallet, a steaming cup in her hands. "Drink," she said, simply offering it to him. "Help sleep demons." Ethan took the cup, the familiar knot of distrust loosening slightly. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of mint beneath the stronger herbs. "What is it?" he asked after sipping cautiously. "Medicine," she replied, settling cross-legged on the floor nearby. For bad dreams. She tapped her temple. War sickness. Ethan stiffened. How do you know about that? Nara's expression softened slightly. See many warriors. After fight spirit, not same. She made a gesture like something breaking. Inside, break. The simple accuracy of her assessment left Ethan momentarily speechless. He'd never spoken of his nightmares, of the way the war had followed him home, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. Yet here was this Apache woman naming it as casually as one might identify rain or snow. Your people fought against mine, he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Yes, Nara acknowledged without hesitation. Your people take land. My people fight to keep it. She shrugged slightly. Now both lose. Both have dead to mourn. Dead don't care who right. There was something in her words that slipped past Ethan's carefully constructed defenses, a truth so simple it was impossible to argue with. He drank the rest of the herbal tea in silence, watching as she returned to her place near the stove. That night, for the first time in years, Ethan slept without dreams. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear skies. Ethan stood on the porch coffee mug, steaming in his hand, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Nothing disturbed the perfect stillness. No tracks, no distant figures, no sound except the occasional fall of snow from overburdened branches. Behind him, the cabin door opened and Nara stepped out, wrapped in one of his old wool blankets against the cold. Beautiful, she said softly, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Ethan nodded, struck by the simple appreciation in her voice, a quality he had long since lost in his vigilance against the world's dangers. Storm bought you time, he said. If Harrington's men were tracking you, the snow will have covered your trail. Nara's eyes moved across the tree line, her expression unconvinced. Blue-eye patient, she said. Wait long time to get what he want. And there was something in her certainty that Ethan couldn't dismiss. He'd survived the war by trusting his instincts, by listening to the quiet voice that warned of danger before any tangible signs appeared. That same voice was whispering now despite the peaceful scene before them. I'll check the perimeter, he decided. See if anyone's been around during the storm. Nara nodded, understanding his caution. I help, she offered. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. Better you stay here out of sight. Your tracks would be easy to follow in fresh snow. She accepted his reasoning without argument, though Ethan could see she was uncomfortable being left behind. It struck him how quickly she had integrated herself into his solitary existence, no longer a reluctant guest, but something closer to a partner. The realization was unsettling. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something Ethan had ruthlessly excised from his life since burying Thomas. He spent the morning breaking trail through the deep snow, making a wide circle around his property. Near the creek that marked the eastern boundary, he found what he'd been half expecting, half dreading tracks partially filled with fresh snow heading north toward the main trail. At least 2 horses, possibly 3. Ethan crouched studying the signs with the careful attention he'd learned during his scouting days. The tracks were fresh, made after the storm ended, but before dawn. Whoever had been watching his cabin had left, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't return. When he returned to the cabin, he found Nara waiting anxiously by the window, tension evident in the line of her shoulders. They were here, she said as soon as he entered, not a question, but a statement. Ethan nodded, hanging his coat by the door. Camped about half a mile east in the pines. Left this morning heading north. Toward town, Nara said, her hands unconsciously moving to the medicine book she kept always near. Likely, Ethan agreed. Probably to resupply, maybe get information. He didn't add what they both knew, that in Rivercross, the nearest settlement money could loosen tongues. If Harrington was asking questions showing Nara's description, someone might remember seeing Ethan in town, might speculate about his isolated cabin in the foothills. "We need to prepare," Ethan said after a moment. "In case they return." Nara nodded immediately, her fear giving way to a practical focus that Ethan found himself respecting. "What we do?" As he laid out his rifle on the table, Ethan realized he had already made his choice. Not just to help Nara escape, but to position himself against Harrington, against the man who had saved his life. The implications of that decision were too complex to fully examine, so he focused instead on the immediate problem. "I need to go into town," he said finally. "Find out what Harrington is doing, how many men he has, what they know." Alarm flashed across Nara's face. "Leave me here alone." "It's safer," Ethan insisted. "If I take you to town and Harrington is there—" "I not hide while you risk," she interrupted, her voice firm, despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "I fight my battle." "This isn't about bravery," Ethan countered, frustration edging his voice. "It's strategy. I can move through town without raising suspicion. I can listen, gather information. If you're with me, we might as well announce ourselves to Harrington." They locked eyes, a silent battle of wills that reminded Ethan she was far from broken, despite all she had endured. Finally, Nara nodded once, conceding the logic of his argument, if not the sentiment behind it. "You go," she agreed. "But I prepare here, make cabins safe." Relief mingled with admiration in Ethan's chest. "I'll leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "Should be able to make it to town and back within 2 days if the weather holds." As evening approached and they worked together securing the cabin, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Nara's presence beside him. The quiet competence in her movements, the occasional brush of her hand against his as they reinforced the door's bar, or ensured the shutters could be quickly closed and latched from inside. When darkness fell, they sat before the fire sharing a simple meal, the practical tasks of the day having kept conversation minimal. Now, in the quiet intimacy of the cabin's warmth, the unspoken tension between them seemed to fill the air. "When you see Blue Eye," Nara said, finally breaking the silence. "What you do?" The question caught Ethan off guard, though it shouldn't have. It was the core issue he'd been avoiding since recognizing Harrington's handwriting. "I don't know," he admitted, setting aside his empty bowl. "I need to understand what's happening first. See if it's really him, how many men he has, what he knows about where you are." Nara studied him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You owe him," she observed quietly. Ethan looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Your eyes," she said simply. "When you see his writing, show debt. Show—" She searched for the word loyalty fight with new thoughts. Her perception was unnervingly accurate. "He saved my life during the war," Ethan acknowledged, "after an Apache ambush that killed my best friend." Understanding dawned in Nara's expression. "Apache kill your friend," she said. "Yet you help Apache woman." It wasn't quite a question, but Ethan heard it anyway. "I'm not sure I'm helping you," he replied more harshly than he intended. "I'm trying to keep trouble from my door. That's all." The moment the words left his mouth, Ethan knew they were a lie. Nara clearly knew it too, but she didn't challenge him. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting his need to maintain the fiction of detachment. "Blue Eye also save lives," she said after a moment. "Then take lives. Man can be both thing." She looked at him directly. You also both things, killer and healer, enemy and, she hesitated, then finished softly, friend. The word hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in its implication. Friend. Was that what they had become in these strange, isolated days? Or was it something else entirely? Something Ethan wasn't ready to name. Get some rest, he said, finally standing to clear their dishes. I'll leave before dawn. Nara watched him for a moment longer, something unreadable in her expression. Then she rose as well, moving to her place near the stove, with the fluid grace that characterized all her movements. Outside, the temperature dropped as night deepened, stars emerging in a sky cleared by the storm's passage. Inside the cabin held its warmth a small haven of light and life in the vast, cold wilderness. And within that haven, two people who by all rights should have been enemies found themselves bound by a connection neither had sought, but neither could now deny. Dawn was still hours away when Ethan woke to the sound of breaking glass. He was on his feet, in an instant, rifle in hand, moving silently toward the window where the sound had come from. Beside him, Nara was already awake, a knife clutched in her hand, her eyes wide but focused in the dimness. A voice called from outside, unnervingly close to the cabin. "Ethan Caldwell, I know you're in there. I know what you're harboring." The voice was cultured, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. Ethan's blood ran cold as recognition hit him. Harrington. "I just want to talk, Ethan," the voice continued. "Soldier to doctor, man to man." Nara gripped Ethan's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Blue Eye," she whispered, fear evident despite her brave front. "He find us." "Stay back from the windows," Ethan ordered quietly, moving toward the door. "How many men does he usually travel with?" 2, 3, Nara replied, following his instructions but keeping the knife ready. "Good shots. No mercy." Ethan's mind raced. The cabin was defensible but isolated. If Harrington had brought enough men, they could be surrounded. Running was possible but difficult in deep snow, especially if they were being tracked. "Ethan," Harrington called again. "I saved your life once. The least you can do is hear me out." The invocation of their shared past twisted something in Ethan's chest, an old loyalty warring with new understanding. He moved to the window, careful to stay to the side of the frame, and peered out. In the pre-dawn darkness, he could make out 3 figures, Harrington in the center, flanked by 2 armed men. They stood just beyond the porch, far enough to be out of immediate reach, but close enough that their rifles would be deadly accurate. "What do you want, Harrington?" Ethan called, keeping his rifle ready. "Just what belongs to me," came the reply, smooth and reasonable. "The Apache woman has stolen valuable research, medical knowledge that could save countless lives. Surely you, of all people, can appreciate that." Ethan glanced at Nara, saw the fear and anger warring in her expression. "She says you tortured her," he said, loud enough for Harrington to hear. "Says you killed her people to get that knowledge." A pause, then Harrington's voice again, a hint of impatience now beneath the civil tone. "She's an Indian, Ethan. A savage. They don't understand the greater good, the advancement of science. Some sacrifices are necessary for progress." The casual dismissal of Nara's humanity, the cold justification of atrocity in the name of progress, it cut through Ethan's lingering uncertainty like a blade. "Get off my land, Harrington," he said, his voice hardening. "The woman stays with me." Another pause, longer this time. When Harrington spoke again, the pretense of civility had dropped away entirely. "I didn't want it to come to this, Ethan. I respected you as a soldier. But if you side with her against your own kind, against the man who saved your life, then you're no better than the savages who killed your friend." Thomas. Even after all these years, the mention of his name was like a physical blow. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle, anger flaring hot and sudden. "Don't you dare speak his name," he growled. "You don't have the right." "But I do," Harrington replied, his voice taking on a strange, almost triumphant quality. "I have every right, because I know something about Thomas's death that you don't. Something that might change how you feel about your Apache house guest." Ethan froze, a cold dread seeping into his bones. "What are you talking about?" "Come out and talk," Harrington urged, "man to man. I'll tell you everything." Nara moved closer to Ethan, her expression troubled. "What'd he say about friend?" she whispered. "I don't know," Ethan replied quietly. "But he's trying to manipulate me, to turn me against you." She held his gaze, something vulnerable and fierce in her eyes. "You trust him or trust me?" It was the question at the heart of everything, the choice that had been building since the moment Nara staggered, bleeding across his yard. Trust the man who had saved his life, but whose actions spoke of a moral corruption Ethan couldn't ignore. Or trust the woman who by all rights should have been his enemy, but whose quiet strength and dignity had begun to heal wounds he hadn't known were still bleeding. "I'm coming out," Ethan called to Harrington. "Just me. My rifle stays inside." "Ethan, no!" Nara hissed, grabbing his arm. "He lie! He kill you!" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to meet her eyes. "I need to know what he's talking about," he said quietly. "About Thomas. I need to know the truth." Something in his expression must have convinced her, for after a moment she released his arm, her face settling into a resigned determination. "If you not come back," she said, "I fight, not let him take book, not let him take me." Ethan nodded, respecting the courage it took for her to let him go when every instinct must have screamed to stop him. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it unless you hear my voice. And Nara—" He hesitated, then finished firmly, "I'm coming back." He set his rifle down reluctantly, keeping only his revolver at his hip, then moved to the door. As he stepped onto the porch, the cold air bit through his thin shirt, a sharp reminder of vulnerability. Harrington stood in the yard, tall and imposing, despite his years, his reddish-gray hair visible even in the dim pre-dawn light. His two companions, hard-faced men with the watchful eyes of experienced killers, flanked him with rifles held casually but ready. "Ethan," Harrington greeted him, his tone almost warm, as though they were old friends meeting after a long separation. "You're looking well. Solitude suits you, it seems." "What do you want, Harrington?" Ethan asked, keeping his hands visible but close enough to his holster that he could draw if needed. "What's this about Thomas?" Harrington smiled, the expression not reaching his cold blue eyes. "Direct as always. I admired that about you during the war." He took a step forward, stopping when Ethan tensed. "Very well. The truth, then. The Apache woman you're protecting, did she tell you her full history, her family connections?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Her brother," Harrington said simply. "A warrior named Cowboy. Does that name mean anything to you?" It didn't, and Ethan's confusion must have shown on his face, for Harrington's smile widened slightly. "I thought not. Cowboy was the war chief who led the ambush on your unit, the one who personally shot the arrow that killed Thomas." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He stared at Harrington, searching for any sign of deception, finding none. "You're lying," he said finally, but even to his own ears, the denial sounded hollow. "Am I?" Harrington countered smoothly. "Ask her yourself. Ask her about Cowboy. Watch her face when you do. You'll see the truth." Ethan's mind raced, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Nara's hesitation when he'd mentioned Thomas's death, her understanding of his nightmares, her comment that both sides had dead to mourn. Even if that's true, Ethan said slowly, she isn't responsible for her brother's actions. Isn't she? Harrington's voice hardened. Their kind stick together, Ethan. Family tribe, it's all the same. She wouldn't hesitate to kill you if it served her purpose. He gestured toward the cabin. She's using you, playing on your decency while she plots her escape with knowledge that rightfully belongs to civilization. The accusation struck uncomfortably close to fears Ethan had harbored himself in the early days of Nara's stay. Yet now, having seen her courage, her dignity, her unfailing honesty, even when it would have been easier to lie, he found he couldn't believe it. The knowledge in that book belongs to her people, he said firmly. And from what I've seen, your civilization hasn't earned the right to it. Harrington's expression hardened, all pretense of friendliness dropping away. I saved your life, Caldwell. I pulled the arrow from your shoulder, stopped the bleeding, kept the fever at bay. You owe me your existence. I owe you for saving my life, Ethan acknowledged. Not for becoming the kind of man who tortures women and massacres villages in the name of progress. A tense silence fell, broken only by the soft crunch of snow as Harrington's men shifted positions, spreading out slightly to either side. So that's your choice, Harrington asked finally, his voice dangerous quiet. To side with a savage against your own kind, against the man who saved you. Ethan met his gaze steadily. My choice is to stand against cruelty no matter who practices it. My choice is to protect someone who needs protection, regardless of the color of their skin. He straightened, something long buried, surfacing in his chest, a sense of purpose, of rightness. Thomas would have done the same. At the mention of Thomas's name, something ugly flashed across Harrington's face. Thomas was a fool who died a fool's death, he spat, and it seems you're determined to follow him. His hand moved in a subtle signal to his men, but Ethan had been watching for it. He threw himself to the side as the first shot rang out, drawing his revolver as he rolled behind a stack of firewood. The bullet splintered the cabin door where he'd been standing moments before. From inside, he heard Nara cry out in alarm, but there was no time to reassure her. Harrington's men were moving to flank him, using the pre-dawn shadows for cover. Ethan fired twice, forcing them to duck behind trees at the edge of the yard. Harrington himself had taken cover behind a water barrel, his own pistol now visible in his hand. This can still end peacefully, Ethan, he called. Send out the woman and the book, and we'll leave you in peace. Like you left her village in peace, Ethan shouted back, checking his ammunition. 4 shots left with no clear line on either of Harrington's men. A movement at the cabin window caught his eye, Nara rifle in hand, taking careful aim at one of the gunmen. Before Ethan could warn her to stay back, she fired the shot, echoing across the yard. One of Harrington's men cried out, clutching his arm as he staggered back into the trees. In the momentary distraction, Ethan made his move, darting toward the porch, while firing twice to keep the second gunman pinned down. He reached the steps just as Nara opened the door, rifle extended to cover his retreat. As he dove inside, a bullet thudded into the door frame inches from his head. Nara slammed the door shut behind him, dropping the heavy bar into place with a solid thunk. "Are you hit?" she demanded, checking him quickly for wounds. "No," Ethan gasped, catching his breath. "But they're not going away." Nara's eyes were hard as flint, her earlier fear replaced by a cold determination. "Taibe," she said, the name falling between them like a stone. "He tell you about Taibe." Ethan stared at her, still processing everything that had happened. "Your brother," he said finally. "He led the ambush that killed Thomas." Nara didn't flinch from the accusation. She met his gaze directly, her chin lifting slightly. Yeah, she admitted. Taibe-led warriors against soldiers who burn our fields, poison our water. Her eyes held his unflinching. He die 2 moons later. Blue-eye soldiers kill him. Outside, Harrington's voice rose above the momentary silence. Ethan, this is your last chance. Send her out, or we burn you both out. The threat was real. Ethan had a woodpile stacked against the cabin's north wall, dry enough to catch fire even in the snow. If Harrington's men reached it with torches, the entire structure would go up in minutes. We need to move, he said, checking his revolver. They'll have us surrounded soon. Nara nodded already, gathering her medicine book and pouch. Where go? Ethan crossed to the far wall, pulling up a floorboard to reveal a small cache, extra ammunition, dried food, basic supplies. There's a hunting cabin about 5 miles west, near the ridge, he said, quickly loading a pack. If we can reach the heavy forest, we can lose them in the trees. Why you still help? Nara asked suddenly, her voice quiet but intense. After know about Tebe. Ethan paused, meeting her gaze across the dimness of the cabin. Outside, he could hear Harrington's men moving into position surrounding them. Time was running out. Because you're not your brother, he said simply. Because this cycle of revenge and hatred has to end somewhere. He shouldered the pack, checking that his revolver was fully loaded. And because it's the right thing to do. Something shifted in Nara's expression, a softening, a warming, a trust that went beyond their fragile alliance of necessity. She crossed to him, reaching up to touch his cheek, in a gesture so unexpected and gentle that it stole his breath. Good man, she said softly. Thomas have good friend. The mention of Thomas's name on her lips should have angered him, should have reinforced the barriers between them. Instead, it felt like a bridge being built, a connection forming across a divide that had once seemed unbridgeable. A crash against the door broke the moment Harrington's men beginning their assault. Smoke began to seep through the cracks in the walls as the first torch found its mark against the woodpile. Ready? Ethan asked, moving toward the back window. Nara nodded, clutching her precious book against her chest, her eyes reflecting the first glimmer of flames now visible through the cabin's cracks. Ready, she confirmed, her voice steady, despite the danger. Together. The forest swallowed them like ghosts, 2 shadows moving swift and silent through the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, orange flames devoured Ethan's cabin, 7 years of solitude reduced to ash and memory. Ahead lay wilderness, deep snow, and the uncertain promise of sanctuary. Stay close, Ethan murmured, breaking trail through knee-deep drifts. Each step was calculated not just for ease of passage, but to minimize the tracks they left behind. The storm will cover our trail, but not fast enough. Nara followed without complaint, the medicine book secured against her skin beneath her dress. Blood had seeped through her bandage, a dark stain spreading slowly across her side, but her face remained composed, focused only on survival. As first light painted the eastern sky in pale gold, Ethan paused atop a small rise, surveying the landscape they'd traversed. Their trail was painfully obvious, 2 dark lines cutting through pristine white, a clear map for anyone who followed. We need to find the river, he decided. Water leaves no tracks. Nara nodded, her breath clouding in the frigid air. How far? 3 miles east. Can you make it? Her eyes met his, unflinching. Yes. The simple certainty in her voice struck something in Ethan's chest. She'd lost her home, her people suffered wounds both physical and deeper, yet her spirit remained unbowed. He found himself wondering if he would have shown the same resilience in her place. They pressed on as the day brightened around them, moving from shadow to shadow, pausing often to listen for sounds of pursuit. The wilderness stretched empty and silent save for the occasional fall of snow from overburdened branches or the distant cry of a hunting hawk. Near midday, they crested a ridge that offered a view of the valley below. There, winding through the white landscape like a slate-gray ribbon, lay the river Ethan sought. But what caught his attention, sent ice through his veins, despite the exertion's warmth, were the three riders moving along its banks, heading north. "Harrington," he breathed, pulling Nara down beside him into the shelter of a fallen pine. She went still beside him, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. "How they find rivers so fast?" "He knows these mountains," Ethan replied grimly. "Probably guessed our destination." The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd underestimated Harrington, had allowed himself to believe they might have more time before pursuit caught up. That mistake could prove fatal. "What now?" Nara asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite the danger. Ethan studied the terrain, weighing their dwindling options. "We can't use the river as planned. We'll have to go higher into the mountains." He pointed toward the western ridges. "There's a pass through there. Difficult terrain, but it might throw them off our trail." "More snow up there," Nara observed. "Your clothes still wet. Dangerous." The concern in her voice was unexpected, touching something long dormant in Ethan. After years of caring for no one, and being cared for by no one, the simple evidence of another's worry for his welfare felt like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. "We don't have much choice," he said. "Unless—" A half-formed plan took shape in his mind, reckless, perhaps, but offering a chance where few existed. "Unless what?" Nara prompted, reading the shift in his expression. "Unless we split up," Ethan said slowly. "I could lead them away, create a false trail. You could continue north, find your way to Blackwater." Nara's reaction was immediate and fierce. "No," she said, the single word carrying the force of absolute certainty. "We stay together. It makes tactical sense," Ethan argued. "You're smaller, faster in this terrain. Without me slowing you—" "No," she repeated, cutting him off with a gesture almost angry in its intensity. "Not leave you to Blue Eye, not after all you risk." Her eyes held his unwavering. Together or not at all. Something in her adamant refusal stirred an emotion Ethan couldn't immediately identify. Respect, certainly, but also a deeper warmth that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the bond forged between them in days of shared danger. "All right," he conceded. "Together." They altered course, moving west toward the mountain pass, a route that would take them higher into the bitter cold, but potentially beyond Harrington's immediate search area. The terrain grew steeper, the snow deeper each step, requiring greater effort as elevation increased. Nara struggled visibly, her earlier stoicism giving way to ragged breathing and occasional stumbles. Ethan found himself reaching back more frequently to steady her concern growing as he noted the increased pallor of her face. "We need to rest," he decided, spotting a cluster of pines that offered some shelter from the wind that had begun to rise as afternoon waned. Just for a moment. She didn't argue itself, a worrying sign from one so determined. As they settled into the relative protection of the evergreens, Ethan checked her wound, finding the bandage soaked through with fresh blood. "This needs changing," he said, his voice tight with concern. "The climb has reopened it." "No time?" Nara replied, though she made no move to rise. "They follow. They'll find 2 corpses if we don't take care of you," Ethan countered, already reaching for the dwindling medical supplies in his pack. "Hold still." Working quickly but carefully, he cleaned the wound and applied a fresh poultice of the pine medicine binding it with their last clean strip of cloth. Throughout the procedure, Nara remained silent, her only reaction an occasional sharp intake of breath when his fingers probed particularly tender areas. "Thank you," she said when he had finished, her eyes meeting his with a directness that had become familiar but still held the power to unsettle him. Ethan nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he felt he'd done little to earn. "Can you continue?" he asked deliberately, shifting focus back to their immediate concerns. "Yes," she replied, her strength of will evident in the way she pushed herself to her feet despite obvious pain. How far to pass? Another hour's climb, Ethan estimated, surveying the mountainside above them. Then a traverse along the ridgeline. There's an old mining cabin near the pass, abandoned, but it might offer shelter for the night. The prospect of proper shelter walls and a roof, however crude, seemed to renew Nara's determination. They set off again, the slope growing steeper, the wind stronger as they left the protection of the tree line behind. As they climbed, Ethan found himself watching Nara with increasing concern. Each step seemed to cost her greater effort, her breathing becoming more labored, her face paler beneath the copper of her skin. Yet she pressed on without complaint, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, as though sheer will could overcome the limits of flesh and blood. They had nearly reached the ridge when disaster struck. A misstep on ice-slick rock sent Nara stumbling sideways, losing her balance on the treacherous slope. Before Ethan could reach her, she fell, sliding several yards down the steep incline before coming to rest against an outcropping of stone. "Nara!" Ethan scrambled down to where she lay, heart pounding with sudden fear. She was conscious, but dazed blood staining the snow beneath her where the fall had reopened her wound yet again. More concerning was the awkward angle of her ankle, already swelling visibly, a sprain at best, possibly a break. "Can you stand?" Ethan asked, helping her to a sitting position. Nara attempted to put weight on the injured ankle, her face going white with pain as she immediately abandoned the effort. "No," she admitted, the simple acknowledgement clearly costing her pride. "Cannot walk." The situation had gone from desperate to potentially fatal. Night was approaching, the temperature dropping with the sun, and they were exposed on the mountainside with inadequate shelter, dwindling supplies, and now an injury that made travel impossible. Ethan made his decision without hesitation. "I'll carry you." Nara stared at him, disbelief evident in her expression. "Too far, too steep. You cannot." "I can." Ethan cut her off, his tone allowing no argument. "I will." Before she could protest further, he gathered her in his arms, surprising them both with the gentleness of the action despite its necessity. She was light, too light, he thought fleetingly, evidence of deprivation long before her wound, but still a burden that would make the climb significantly more challenging. Yet there was no alternative. To remain where they were meant death by exposure. To separate meant leaving her vulnerable to both elements and enemies. The only path forward was together, difficult perhaps, impossible, but the only choice that honored what had grown between them. Nara said nothing as he began to climb, but her arms went around his neck, helping to stabilize her weight, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder, as though the gesture were the most natural thing in the world. The simple trust, implicit in that contact, gave Ethan strength beyond his physical reserves, determination that transcended mere survival. The climb was brutal, each step a battle against gravity, fatigue, and the treacherous terrain. Ethan's muscles burned, his lungs labored in the thin mountain air, sweat freezing on his skin despite the exertion. Yet he continued, finding footholds where none seemed to exist, maintaining balance, where a single slip would mean disaster for them both. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was touching the western peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Ethan paused, allowing himself a moment to catch his breath while surveying their surroundings. The pass lay ahead, a notch between higher peaks, and nestled just below it, almost invisible against the darkening slope, was the abandoned mining cabin he'd mentioned. "We're close," he told Nara, his voice rough with effort. "Can you see it? Just below the pass." She lifted her head from his shoulder, following his gaze. "Yes," she said softly. "See it. Not far now." The simple encouragement in her words renewed Ethan's determination. He adjusted his grip and continued along the ridge, each step bringing them closer to potential safety. Twilight was deepening into true night by the time they reached the cabin, a crude structure of rough-hewn logs and a sod roof half buried in snow, but intact enough to offer genuine shelter. Ethan set Nara down gently against the outer wall while he forced the frozen door open, revealing a single room containing little more than a crude stone fireplace and a dilapidated wooden platform that had once served as a bed. "It's not much," he said, helping Nara inside and closing the door against the bitter mountain night. "But it's better than the open ridge." "Palace?" Nara replied with unexpected humor, the ghost of a smile touching her lips despite her obvious pain. "After cave and snow." The simple jest, so unexpected in their dire circumstances, startled a brief laugh from Ethan, the sound strange to his own ears after so many years of silence and solitude. For a moment, despite the danger that still pursued them, despite cold and wounds and uncertain future, something like happiness flickered between them in the gathering darkness of the abandoned cabin. Ethan set about creating a fire in the ancient hearth, grateful to find a small stock of wood left by the cabin's last occupant, likely a trapper or prospector who had used it as a seasonal shelter. The flames, when they finally caught and grew, transformed the space from merely enclosed to genuinely welcoming, pushing back the cold that had seeped into their very bones during the long day's journey. With the immediate need for warmth addressed, Ethan turned his attention to Nara's injuries. Her ankle was badly swollen now, mottled with bruising, that suggested a severe sprain rather than a break, painful and debilitating, but not immediately life-threatening. More concerning was her side, where the wound had begun bleeding again, the bandage soaked through despite his earlier care. "We need to clean this properly," he said gently, removing the blood-stained cloth. "And your ankle needs binding." Nara nodded, watching with clinical interest as he worked. "You have good hands," she observed, "gentle but sure, like healer." "Field medicine," Ethan explained, focused on cleaning the reopened wound. "During the war, every soldier learned at least the basics. Some of us more than others." "You were more than soldier," Nara said, her dark eyes studying his face in the firelight. "Something before war. Something gentle." The observation, so accurate it was almost unnerving, caught Ethan off guard. He'd spent years burying the man he'd been before the conflict, building walls around memories that hurt too much to examine. "I was studying medicine," he admitted finally, the words feeling strange after so long unspoken. "At a university back east. Thomas and I both. Then the war came, and we enlisted." His hands stilled momentarily on her ankle as he bound it with strips torn from his spare shirt. "I never went back afterward. Couldn't face it. All that talk of healing when I'd seen done so much harm." Nara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. "War take many things," she said at last. "From all people. Take homes, take lives, take futures that might have been." "Yes," Ethan agreed, the simple word inadequate for the complexity of loss they both understood. "It does." They fell silent. Then the only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the occasional moan of wind around the cabin's rough corners. Ethan finished tending Nara's injuries, then set about preparing a meager meal from their dwindling supplies. Jerky softened in hot water, the last of his coffee brewed strong and dark. As they ate, sitting close to the fire for warmth, Ethan found himself studying Nara in the flickering light. The firelight caught the high planes of her cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes. She was beautiful, he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, not despite the circumstances that had brought her to his door, but perhaps because of them. Her strength, her dignity, her unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These were not superficial qualities that would fade with time or ease, but essential elements of who she was. "What?" Nara asked, catching his gaze on her face. Ethan looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking," he said, a half-truth that felt cowardly even as he offered it. "About," she pressed, setting aside her empty cup. "The path that brought us here," he replied, finding safer ground in philosophical reflection. "How strange it is that our lives intersected. A year ago, even a month ago, I would have considered you an enemy, would have seen only Apache instead of Nara." She nodded, understanding evident in her expression. "And I see only soldier, not Ethan." Her hand moved unconsciously to the medicine book always kept close. "But now," Ethan prompted when she didn't continue. Nara met his gaze directly, something vulnerable yet determined in her eyes. "Now I see men who risk everything for someone not his kind, who carry me up mountain when could leave behind, who clean wounds with gentle hands that once held weapons." She paused, then added quietly, "I see Ethan." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet certainty, pierced defenses Ethan hadn't realized he still maintained. Since Thomas's death, since the war's end, he had carried a burden of guilt and isolation, believing himself unworthy of connection, incapable of being seen without judgment for the blood on his hands. Yet here was this woman, by all rights, his enemy, who looked at him and saw not just his past, but his present, perhaps even possibilities he himself had abandoned. "And I see Nara," he replied, the words feeling inadequate yet necessary. "Not enemy, not Apache, just you." Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a warming that transformed her features in the firelight. For a moment, Ethan thought she might speak, might put into words whatever was growing between them in these strange, dangerous days. Instead, she reached out her fingers, brushing his hand, where it rested on his knee, a touch so light it might have been accidental, were it not for the deliberate intent in her eyes. Ethan turned his hand, catching her fingers with his own, before she could withdraw. The contact was simple, palm against palm, fingers loosely intertwined, yet it carried a significance that transcended words. Not a demand or a promise, but an acknowledgement of connection neither had sought yet, both now valued beyond measure. They sat thus, hands joined in the firelight, as night deepened around the small cabin and wind sang its lonely song through the mountain pass beyond. No words seemed necessary in that moment, or perhaps no words seemed adequate for what had begun to take shape between them. Eventually, practicality reasserted itself. The cabin was warmer than the open mountainside, but still bitter cold, away from the fire's immediate circle. They would need to share body heat to survive the night comfortably. "You should rest," Ethan said reluctantly, releasing Nara's hand to add more wood to the fire. "I'll take first watch." Nara shook her head. "No need for watch," she pointed out practically. "If blue-eye men find cabin in night, nowhere to run anyway. Better both rest, keep strength." The logic was undeniable, though it went against Ethan's training to sleep without someone standing guard. Yet they were high on the mountain in a sheltered pass, with fresh snow covering their tracks. The likelihood of discovery before dawn was minimal. "All right," he conceded, "but we should still take precautions." Together, they arranged their meager bedding near the fire, Ethan's coat spread beneath them, their single blanket above, supplemented by pine boughs he gathered from just outside the cabin door. The makeshift bed was far from comfortable, but compared to their previous night's shelter beneath the fallen tree, it seemed almost luxurious. Nara settled onto this simple pallet, making room for Ethan beside her with a naturalness that belied the intimacy of the arrangement. He joined her after banking the fire to last through the night, his body fitting against hers with surprising ease, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that felt protective without being possessive. "Ethan," Nara said softly after they had lain in silence for some time, her voice barely audible above the fire's gentle crackling. "When this end, if we live, what then?" The question caught him unprepared, forcing him to consider a future he had deliberately avoided contemplating. What then? If they somehow survived Harrington's pursuit, reached Blackwater, found safety, what awaited them in a world that would see nothing but white man and Apache woman instead of Ethan and Nara? "I don't know," he admitted, the darkness making honesty easier. "I hadn't thought beyond keeping us alive." Nara shifted slightly in his arms, turning to face him, though her features were barely visible in the dim light. "I think of it," she said. "Think of after. Must be after, or why fight so hard to live?" The simple wisdom in her words struck Ethan deeply. She was right. Survival alone was insufficient reason to endure what they had endured. There had to be something beyond mere continuation, some purpose that made the struggle meaningful. "What do you see?" he asked. "In this after you imagine?" She was quiet for a long moment, as though carefully considering her answer. "See place where not judged for skin or tribe," she said finally. "Where knowledge and book help people, all people, not just one kind. Where—" She hesitated, then continued with careful precision. "Where two people from different worlds make new world together. Small world, maybe, but real." The vision she described was so far from anything Ethan had allowed himself to imagine that it left him momentarily speechless. A life not defined by war or loss or isolation. A life with purpose, with companionship. A life with Nara. Could such a place exist? He asked softly, the question directed as much to himself as to her. "Not exist yet," Nara replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "We make it. If live." If live. The conditional hung between them, a reminder of the dangers that still surrounded them, the long odds they faced. Yet somehow the acknowledgement of those dangers made the possibility she described more precious rather than less. "Then we'd better live," Ethan said, his fingers tightening around hers. He felt, rather than saw her smile in the darkness. "Yes," she agreed. "Better live." They fell silent, then hands still joined as sleep gradually claimed them, despite the precariousness of their situation. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song through the mountain pass. Inside, two people who should have been enemies dreamed of a future neither had thought possible just days before. Ethan woke to silence, the peculiar absolute stillness that comes only with deep snow and higher altitude. The fire had burned low during the night, but not out its embers, casting a dim red glow across the cabin's interior. Beside him, Nara slept deeply, her breathing, even her features relaxed, in a way they never were during waking hours. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing her, Ethan rose and went to the cabin's single window, a crude opening covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Through this translucent barrier, he could see that dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The pass beyond the cabin still wrapped in pre-dawn shadows. No sign of pursuit, no distant figures moving against the pristine snow. They had gained a night's respite at least. But Ethan harbored no illusions that Harrington had abandoned the chase. The doctor's obsession with the medicine book with Nara herself had been evident in their brief confrontation. Such fixation would not be easily deterred by mere weather or difficult terrain. Turning from the window, Ethan added wood to the fire, coaxing the embers back to flame with practiced patience. The simple task allowed his mind to work on their larger problem, how to proceed with Nara, unable to walk their supplies, dwindling, and Harrington surely closing in despite their temporary advantage. The pass led eventually to Blackwater, perhaps 2 days' journey under normal circumstances, but carrying Nara through deep snow would slow their progress significantly, likely doubling that time. Their food would not last so long, and the weather in these mountains was notoriously unpredictable. A storm could trap them, exposure could kill them as surely as Harrington's bullets. Yet the alternative remaining in the cabin was equally untenable. Eventually, they would be found. The structure offered shelter, but no real defense. No escape route if Harrington's men surrounded it. Movement from the pallet drew Ethan's attention. Nara was awake, watching him with those dark, perceptive eyes that seemed to read his thoughts. "Morning comes," she said softly. "We still live." "We do," Ethan agreed, moving to check her ankle. "How does it feel?" Nara grimaced as he gently probed the injury. "Bad," she admitted, with characteristic honesty. "But not broken, I think. Just angry." The description almost made Ethan smile despite their situation. "Angry is apt," he agreed. "The swelling's down slightly, but you won't be walking on it today. Maybe not tomorrow either." She nodded, accepting this assessment without argument. "You think of how to go forward," she observed. "I see worry in your face." "The pass is our best route to Blackwater," Ethan explained, helping her to sit up against the wall near the fire. "But it's slow going in deep snow, and carrying you will slow us further. Harrington won't give up so easily." "No," Nara agreed. "Blue Eye not give up. Book too important to him." She hesitated, then asked directly, "You still want to help me? Even knowing cost?" The question surprised Ethan, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Despite everything they'd been through together, despite the connection that had grown between them, she had reason to doubt the commitment of a white man, a former soldier, to an Apache woman's safety. "Yes," he said, simply meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I'm with you, Nara. Whatever comes." Something in her expression softened at his words, a vulnerability showing briefly through her usual composed exterior. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me not just Apache." Before Ethan could respond, a sound from outside the cabin froze them both, the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle echoing across the mountainside. "Harrington," Ethan said grimly, moving quickly to the window. Through the oiled paper he could make out 3 figures moving along the ridge they had traversed the previous day, still distant, but clearly following their trail despite the snowfall that had partially obscured it. "How long?" Nara asked, already gathering her few possessions, securing the medicine book inside her dress. "An hour, maybe less," Ethan estimated, calculating the distance and terrain. "They'll move faster than we did without an injured person to carry." Nara's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we go now," she said. "No time for food or rest." Ethan nodded quickly, packing their meager supplies. Within minutes, they were ready, Nara perched on the cabin's single chair, while Ethan made a final check through the window. The pass narrows about a mile ahead, he explained, planning aloud as he worked. High walls on either side difficult to navigate, but also difficult to track someone through. If we can reach it before they spot us, we might gain enough lead to make it to the other side. And if they spot us before? Nara asked practically. Ethan met her gaze, unwilling to soften the harsh reality. Then we'll have to fight. My revolver against their rifles in open terrain. He didn't need to elaborate on the poor odds such a confrontation presented. Nara absorbed this with characteristic calm. Then, better not seen, she concluded. Better not seen, Ethan agreed, crouching before her. Ready, she nodded, slipping her arms around his neck as he gathered her against his chest. The motion felt familiar now, almost natural, her body settling against his, as though they'd done this all their lives, instead of just since the previous day's crisis. Outside, the morning was clear and bitingly cold, the sun not yet high enough to take the edge off the mountain air. Ethan moved quickly from the cabin's shelter, angling away from the ridge where Harrington's men advanced, making directly for the narrow throat of the pass that promised at least temporary concealment. The snow was deep, but navigable, his boots finding purchase in the frozen crust beneath the softer surface layer. Nara remained silent in his arms, her body tense with awareness of the danger behind them, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape ahead. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the pass when disaster nearly struck. Ethan's foot broke through the snow crust, plunging him knee-deep into a hidden depression. He staggered, fighting for balance, nearly dropping Nara as he struggled to regain solid footing. "Hold," she gasped, tightening her arms around his neck, her weight shifting to help him stabilize rather than hindering his recovery. For a crucial moment, they teetered on the edge of a fall that would have left them exposed and vulnerable on the open slope. Then Ethan's foot found solid ground. His balance returned and they continued shaken, but undetected. "Thank you," he said quietly once they were moving steadily again. "Quick thinking." Nara shook her head slightly. "Work together," she replied simply. "Like you say, together or not at all." The echo of his own words from days earlier, words spoken when he had been the protector and she the protected, struck Ethan with unexpected force. They had indeed become partners in this desperate journey, each contributing what they could to their shared survival. They reached the entrance to the narrower section of the pass. Without further incident, the high walls of stone rising on either side, like ancient sentinels guarding the way forward. Here, the terrain grew more challenging, boulder fields partially hidden by snow, occasional ice falls where water had frozen in mid-descent down the stone faces. But the very difficulty that slowed their progress would also hamper pursuit, and the winding nature of the passage would soon hide them from view of anyone still on the open slope behind. Ethan pressed on his muscles, burning with the effort of carrying Nara over such difficult ground, his breath coming in controlled gasps that clouded white in the frigid air. She remained silent, understanding that he needed all his strength for the journey, but her hand occasionally squeezed his shoulder, a wordless encouragement that somehow lent him energy when his own reserves began to flag. They were deep within the pass, the walls towering hundreds of feet on either side, when Ethan heard it, a sound that stopped him mid-stride, sending ice through his veins despite the exertion's heat. Voices, echoing from ahead, not behind. "Do you hear?" Nara whispered, her body tensing in his arms. "Yes," Ethan confirmed grimly. "Someone's coming through the pass from the other side." Harrington had split his forces, sending men around the mountain to approach from both directions, trapping them within the narrow confines of the pass. It was a tactic Ethan himself might have employed in similar circumstances, and he cursed himself for not anticipating it. "What now?" Nara asked, no fear in her voice, despite the obvious peril only a practical assessment of their dwindling options. Ethan scanned their surroundings, seeking any possibility of escape or concealment. The pass walls were steep, but not sheer. A skilled climber might ascend them, finding hand and footholds among the rough stone and ice. But not while carrying another person, and certainly not with Nara's injured ankle preventing her from climbing herself. "There," she said, suddenly pointing to a dark crevice in the southern wall, a fissure barely visible among the complex shadows and snow-covered contours of the stone face. "Cave, maybe." Ethan altered course immediately, making for the potential shelter she'd spotted. As they drew closer, the opening resolved into exactly what Nara had hoped, a narrow but navigable crack in the cliff face, widening into what appeared to be a small cave beyond. "Good eyes," Ethan said with genuine appreciation as he maneuvered them through the tight entrance. Inside, the space opened enough for them to stand upright, though not much more. It was a shallow cave rather than a deep one, perhaps 20 feet from entrance to rear wall, but it offered concealment from casual observation, protection from the wind, and, most importantly, a defensible position should they be discovered. Ethan set Nara down carefully on a relatively flat section of stone floor, then moved back to the entrance, peering out through the narrow opening. From this vantage, he could see a section of the pass in both directions, enough to spot approaching danger, but not so exposed as to be easily noticed from without. "They come closer," Nara observed, having joined him at the entrance, despite her injured ankle moving, by bracing herself against the cave wall. "Both sides." She was right. The voices from the eastern approach were louder, now distinct words occasionally carrying to their hiding place. From the west, the direction they had come, Ethan could make out the dark shapes of Harrington's original party, moving cautiously but steadily through the boulder field they themselves had traversed minutes earlier. "We're trapped," he acknowledged the tactical reality, impossible to deny. "They'll meet in the pass just below us. If they search carefully enough, they find us," Nara finished for him, her expression grim but composed. "Then we fight." Ethan checked his revolver, 5 rounds remaining, with a handful of loose cartridges in his pocket. Against at least 6 men with rifles, the odds were beyond poor. "I'll hold them off as long as possible," he said, a plan forming even as he spoke. "If I can create a diversion, you might be able to slip past in the confusion. Make your way to Blackwater." Nara's response was immediate and fierce. "No," she said, the single word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not leave you." "It makes tactical sense," Ethan argued, though he knew even as he spoke that his logic would not sway her. "The book is what matters, the knowledge of your people. It needs to survive, even if we don't. Book not matter without people to use knowledge." Nara countered, her hand finding his arm gripping with surprising strength. "Not leave you to die alone, Ethan. Not after everything." There it was again, that unwavering loyalty, that refusal to abandon him despite the clear advantage it would offer her. It humbled Ethan even as it complicated their already desperate situation. "Then we face them together," he conceded, covering her hand with his own. "Make our stand here. Maybe take a few with us before they take us." The grim acknowledgement of their likely fate hung between them for a moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Nara's expression shifted, a calculating light entering her dark eyes. "Or maybe," she said slowly, "we make them take each other." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, intrigued, despite his pessimism. Nara gestured to the pass below, where Harrington's forces approached from both directions, still out of sight of one another, around a bend in the narrow canyon. "They not see each other yet," she explained. "Only hear voices. Maybe think it us they hear." Understanding dawned in Ethan's mind, a strategy taking shape from her simple observation. If we could make them fire at each other, he said, thinking aloud, create confusion, make them think they're under attack. Yes? Nara confirmed, a fierce smile touching her lips. Turn hunters against each other. It was a desperate plan, with countless ways it could fail. But it offered a slim chance where none had existed before, and sometimes Ethan knew from bitter experience a slim chance was all one could hope for in circumstances like these. I'll need to get closer, he said, formulating the specifics rapidly. Find a position where I can fire without being immediately spotted. Make them think the shots are coming from their own people. I go too, Nara insisted. Can still shoot, even if not walk well. Ethan shook his head firmly. Too risky. Your ankle. My choice, she interrupted, that familiar determination hardening her features. My life to risk. Together, remember. They locked eyes for a long moment. A silent battle of wills that Ethan realized he could not win, nor perhaps should he try to. Nara was offering not just assistance, but partnership, claiming her right to fight for her own survival, rather than being merely protected. All right, he conceded. Together. They moved quickly, gathering what they would need, leaving their meager supplies cached in the cave's recesses in case they were able to return. Ethan helped Nara to a position near the entrance where she could brace herself against the rock wall, her view of the pass clear enough for a shot, but her body concealed from casual observation. Wait for my signal, he instructed, checking that her borrowed pistol, an old Navy Colt he'd carried as a backup, was fully loaded. One shot from me, then you fire at the eastern group. Make them think they're caught in a crossfire. Nara nodded, her grip on the pistol steady, despite the tension evident in every line of her body. Be careful, she said quietly. Come back. I will. Ethan promised, the words carrying more weight than such assurances usually held. He slipped out of the cave and into the complex terrain of the pass, using boulders and snowdrifts for cover, as he worked his way to a position that offered a clear view of both approaching parties. They were closer now, perhaps 100 yards from meeting, though still hidden from each other by the winding nature of the canyon. Ethan settled behind a large rock, steadying his revolver on its snow-covered surface. The shot would need to be precise, close enough to the western party to make the eastern group believe they were under attack, but not so close as to actually hit anyone. Harrington he might have willingly shot, but the doctor's hired men were merely doing a job, however morally questionable. He drew a deep breath, sighted along the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by the natural acoustics of the narrow space. The western party, Harrington and 2 riflemen, immediately dove for cover, clearly believing they were being fired upon from ahead. As planned, Nara's shot followed seconds later, the smaller caliber of her pistol creating a distinctly different report that seemed to come from the opposite direction. The eastern party. 3 men Ethan hadn't seen before, likely hired in town, reacted with predictable alarm, returning fire toward where they believed the attack originated. Within moments, the pass had erupted into chaos, shots echoing from wall to wall, men shouting in confusion, snow kicking up as bullets struck all around. Ethan fired twice more, careful to aim well clear of actual targets, reinforcing the impression of multiple attackers. The deception worked better than he could have hoped. Unable to see each other clearly through the narrow, winding pass, both parties believed they were under attack from hostiles ahead. They exchanged fire with increasing desperation, effectively pinning each other down, while Ethan worked his way back to the cave entrance. It's working, he reported to Nara, who had maintained her position but held her fire after the initial shot, conserving ammunition. They're completely confused, shooting at shadows. Good, she said, relief evident in her voice. Now what? Now we use the distraction, Ethan replied, helping her to her feet. There's a side canyon about 50 yards back. I noticed it when we passed. If we can reach it, while they're occupied with each other, we might find another way through the mountains." Supporting Nara as she hobbled from their shelter, Ethan kept constant watch on the firefight below. The exchange had slowed, but not stopped. Occasional shots still rang out, accompanied by shouted demands for surrender or identification that went unanswered in the confusion. They had nearly reached the side canyon when a shout from below froze them in place. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" Harrington's voice, unmistakable in its cultured authority, cut through the chaos. The shooting stopped abruptly, an eerie silence falling over the pass as both parties finally realized they had been firing at each other rather than their intended quarry. "We've been tricked," Harrington continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "They're here somewhere, watching us make fools of ourselves. While they escape," Ethan pulled Nara into the shadow of a large boulder, just as one of the riflemen began scanning the canyon walls, searching for any sign of movement or concealment. "Time's up," Ethan whispered, calculating their dwindling options. "They'll find us within minutes once they start a proper search." Nara's eyes met his, no fear in them despite the closing net. What now? Ethan made his decision in that moment not from tactical assessment or strategic planning, but from something deeper and more certain. "Now," he said quietly, "we stop running." Understanding dawned in Nara's expression, not resignation to defeat, but recognition of a choice made from strength rather than weakness. "Face blue eye," she said. "End this. End this," Ethan agreed, one way or another. Together, they stepped from the shadow of the boulder, Ethan supporting Nara with one arm, while holding his revolver ready with the other, facing down into the pass where Harrington and his men had gathered, attempting to sort out the confusion of their misdirected firefight. "Harrington," Ethan called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This ends now." 6 faces turned upward, 6 weapons raised toward the unexpected target suddenly revealed. But it was Harrington who stepped forward, a strange smile spreading across his features as he recognized not just Ethan, but the woman at his side. "Indeed, it does, Caldwell," he called back, something like triumph in his voice. "Indeed, it does." "Indeed, it does, Caldwell," Harrington called, triumph coloring his voice. "Indeed, it does." The doctor stood in the pass below, flanked by 5 armed men whose rifles remained trained on Ethan and Nara. Despite the tactical disadvantage of lower ground, Harrington projected absolute confidence, the assurance of a man accustomed to bending others to his will. "You've led us on quite a chase," he continued, removing his gloves with meticulous precision. "Impressive, considering the woman's condition." His clinical gaze assessed Nara's fever-flushed face, her obvious weakness. "But as I have always maintained, prolonging the inevitable merely increases suffering." Ethan kept his revolver steady, despite knowing the gesture was largely symbolic against 5 rifles. Beside him, Nara stood with dignity that transcended her injured ankle and advancing infection, chin raised in silent defiance. "Let her go, Harrington," Ethan said, his voice carrying in the mountain stillness. "Your quarrel's with me now." "Quarrel?" Harrington's eyebrows rose. "Is that what you imagine this is? Some petty disagreement between former colleagues?" He shook his head, the gesture almost paternal in its condescension. "This is about something far greater than either of us, Ethan. This is about discovery that could revolutionize medicine, save countless lives. Discovery doesn't require torture." Ethan countered, his free arm instinctively tightening around Nara's waist as she swayed slightly beside him. "It doesn't justify massacring innocent people." "Innocent?" Harrington's voice sharpened. "Like her brother, perhaps. The war chief who led the ambush that killed your friend, Thomas. His eyes narrowed, watching for impact. Oh, she told you about that, did she? How surprisingly honest of her. She told me, Ethan confirmed, refusing to give Harrington the satisfaction of seeing him unsettled. Just as she told me what you did to her village. How you slaughtered her people for knowledge they would have shared freely if approached with respect rather than rifles. Something flickered across Harrington's face, a momentary crack in his composed facade quickly masked. You've become remarkably sentimental for a man who once pledged himself to healing at any cost, he observed. Have you forgotten our conversations during the war? The greater good we discussed as we worked over dying boys who should never have been on those battlefields. The memory surfaced unbidden midnight debates in field hospitals reeking of blood and chloroform philosophical discussions that had seemed profound amid the carnage, but now rang hollow in Ethan's ears. I remember, he acknowledged, but there's a difference between triage necessitated by war and deliberate cruelty in pursuit of personal glory. Glory. Harrington seemed genuinely offended. You think this is about glory, about recognition? He gestured expansively at the wilderness surrounding them. Look around you, Ethan. I've abandoned a prestigious position at Boston Medical College financing this expedition with my own funds, risking my reputation on what many colleagues would dismiss as native superstition. Then why? Ethan demanded. If not fame or fortune, what drives you to such extremes? Harrington's expression shifted, something almost evangelical entering his eyes. Advancement, he said simply, the inexorable march of medical science, the conquest of disease and mortality that has been humanity's dream since we first recognized our own inevitable decay. His voice lowered, intensified. The waters in that valley can heal injuries modern medicine cannot touch, infections that resist our strongest compounds, perhaps even... He checked himself, then continued more measured. The implications are profound. For a moment, Ethan glimpsed the brilliant physician Harrington had once been before ambition corrupted his methods. The man's passion for healing was genuine, however twisted his approach had become. Even if you're right, Ethan said, the end doesn't justify these means. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, not in war, not in medicine, not ever. Lines drawn by whom? Harrington countered. By men whose vision extends only to their own lifetimes. History judges by results. Ethan, not by sentimental notions of morality. When these waters save thousands who would otherwise perish, no one will question how they were discovered. I question it, Ethan replied simply. Here and now. Harrington studied him for a long moment, something like genuine regret crossing his features. I expected better from you, he said finally. After everything you witnessed in the war, all the death, all the suffering we couldn't prevent, I thought you understood the calculus of progress. Present pain against future benefit. I understood it too well, Ethan said. Watched that calculus reduce men to numbers, lives to equations. It's a lie we tell ourselves to justify atrocity. Philosophical debates bore me, Harrington said dismissively, gesturing to his men. William Jacob, bring them down. Carefully. I want the book intact, and the woman alive. Two riflemen slung their weapons and began climbing the slope toward Ethan and Nara. Ethan raised his revolver, aiming at the closest man. Stop there, he warned. Next step gets a bullet. The men hesitated, looking to Harrington for guidance. The doctor seemed unperturbed by the threat. You won't shoot them, Ethan, he said with calm certainty. Not in cold blood, not unarmed men following orders. He smiled thinly. You're not that kind of killer. Never were, even during the war. The assessment struck uncomfortably close to truth. Ethan had killed during the conflict, yes, but always in battle, never execution style. Even now, his finger hesitated on the trigger, unwilling to fire on men who, while certainly threatening, had not yet drawn weapons. Sensing his hesitation, the riflemen resumed their approach, more confident with each step. 10 yards separated them from Ethan and Nara, then 8, then 5. It was Nara who acted her movement so sudden it caught even Ethan by surprise. She raised the Navy Colt he'd given her, aimed with calm precision, and fired not at the men, but at a snow cornice overhanging the pass directly above Harrington's position. The shot echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the deeper rumble of shifting snow. The cornice, already unstable from earlier gunfire, broke free, hundreds of pounds of packed snow cascading down toward the men below. "Avalanche!" one of the riflemen shouted, scrambling backward as the white wall descended. Harrington looked up, his expression shifting from confidence to shock in the instant before the snow struck. He and his men disappeared beneath the tumbling mass. Their shouts cut short as the slide filled the narrow pass. "Run!" Nara urged, already turning toward the side canyon Ethan had identified earlier. While they buried... Supporting her weight, Ethan half-carried Nara toward the smaller ravine. Behind them, men were already emerging from the slide, coughing, digging themselves free, temporarily disoriented, but not eliminated from the pursuit. They reached the side canyon just as a rifle shot cracked against stone near their position. Ducking around the corner, they found themselves in a narrow passage winding upward through the mountain, steeper than the main pass, but navigable, even with Nara's injury. "Brilliant shot," Ethan said as they climbed, genuine admiration in his voice. "How did you know the cornice would break?" "Not know," Nara admitted, grimacing as her injured ankle caught against a rock. "Hope only. Old hunting trick, loud noise, shake loose snow." Her modesty only deepened Ethan's respect. Under pressure, that would have paralyzed most she had observed, calculated, and acted decisively, saving them both, when his own moral hesitation might have doomed them. They climbed as rapidly as Nara's condition allowed, the shouts of pursuit growing fainter, but not disappearing entirely. The path was treacherous, loose rock under snow. Occasional ice falls where water had frozen in mid-descent, but it offered escape where none had seemed possible minutes earlier. After perhaps half an hour of grueling ascent, they reached a small plateau where the canyon widened briefly before continuing upward. Ethan eased Nara onto a flat rock, checking her ankle and the wound in her side with gentle fingers. What he found alarmed him more than he let show. The infection had advanced significantly, her skin burning with fever, while her extremities showed the concerning coolness of declining circulation. "We need to rest," he said, seeing the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Just long enough to catch our breath, assess our options." Nara nodded, too drained for pride. "They follow?" she asked, glancing back down the path they'd climbed. "Almost certainly," Ethan confirmed, scanning their back trail. "The avalanche slowed them, but Harrington won't give up, not when he's this close." "No," Nara agreed, her voice weaker than before. "Not give up. Too much want book." Her hand moved unconsciously to where the medicine text remained secured beneath her clothing. Ethan considered their dwindling options. The side canyon continued upward, eventually reaching what appeared to be a higher pass through the mountain ridge. Beyond that lay unknown territory, perhaps a route to black water, perhaps only more wilderness. With Nara's condition deteriorating rapidly, their supplies nearly exhausted, and determined pursuit behind them, the odds of survival diminished with each passing hour. "How far to valley?" he asked suddenly, the question forming even as he spoke it. Nara looked up, surprise momentarily, overriding pain in her expression. Valley Healing Waters. Yes, Ethan confirmed. You said the map was in your memory. If these waters are as powerful as both you and Harrington believe, if they could heal your infection, your ankle. Hope flickered briefly in Nara's fever-bright eyes, then faded as reality reasserted itself. 2 days' journey, she said reluctantly. West from here, through mountains. She gestured to her injured ankle, her fever-weakened body. Cannot reach now. Ethan had expected as much, but disappointment still surged through him. Their one potential salvation lay impossibly distant, while death from infection exposure or Harrington's rifles closed in from all sides. Then we keep moving, he decided, the only option remaining. Over the high pass, if possible. There might be another mining camp on the far side, or at least a hunting cabin where we could treat your infection properly. Nara studied his face, reading more than he had spoken. You not think we make it, she said, not a question but an observation. Ethan hesitated, then decided honesty was the only gift he could offer in their desperate circumstances. The odds are long, he admitted, but I've beaten long odds before. We both have. A ghost of a smile touched Nara's lips. Yes, she agreed. Both beat long odds already. She extended her hand to him. Help me up. We go over mountain. As Ethan took her hand, a shot rang out, echoing through the canyon with startling suddenness. Stone fragments exploded from the rock face inches from his head, the ricochet whining away into silence. Down! Ethan shouted, pulling Nara behind the meager cover of the boulder she'd been sitting on. More shots followed, bullets striking around their position, as Harrington's men worked their way up the side canyon, using the terrain for cover as they advanced. Ethan returned fire. The reports of his revolver thunderous in the confined space, but the attacking riflemen were well concealed, offering only momentary glimpses as they moved from cover to cover. There's too many, he said grimly, counting his remaining ammunition, 3 rounds in the revolver, perhaps a dozen loose cartridges in his pocket. Against 5 rifles, the math was implacable. Nara's eyes met his calm, despite the bullets striking around them. What we do? Before Ethan could answer, a voice called from below, not Harrington's cultured tones, but a rougher, unfamiliar one. Hold your fire, we're not looking for a fight. Ethan and Nara exchanged wary glances, neither believing the declaration. Yet the shooting from below had indeed stopped the sudden silence, almost more unsettling than the previous gunfire. Who are you? Ethan called back, keeping his revolver ready. Name's Samuel Reed, the voice replied, former sergeant with the 7th Cavalry. I'm looking for Dr. James Harrington, heard he was in these mountains. The claim seemed calculated to draw them out, yet something in the man's tone rang with authenticity that Harrington's smooth assurances had always lacked. Harrington's below us, Ethan answered cautiously. Down in the main pass. If it's him you want, you're looking in the wrong direction. A pause, then. Not exactly. Looking for you, too. Or rather, for the Apache woman with you. Before Ethan could respond with renewed hostility, the man continued, to help her, not harm her. I was there at her village, saw what Harrington did, been tracking him since, looking to make amends in what way I can. The claim seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their desperate need for allies. Yet the alternative, continuing their flight with Nara's condition worsening by the hour, offered little hope. Show yourself, Ethan demanded, hands visible, rifle grounded. After a moment's hesitation, a figure emerged from behind a rock outcropping some 30 yards down the path, an older man with weathered features, gray-streaked hair, and the unmistakable bearing of a veteran soldier. As instructed, his hands were raised, his rifle leaning against stone some distance away. "Just want to talk," Reed said, remaining where he stood. "Been following Harrington's party since they burned your cabin. Would have reached you sooner, but the storm slowed me down." Ethan studied the man, years of war and wilderness having honed his ability to read intent in stance and expression. What he saw suggested neither deception nor immediate threat, just the wary caution of a man who had seen too much violence to approach strangers carelessly. "How do we know you're not working for Harrington?" he asked, maintaining his defensive position. Reed's expression hardened. "Because I've seen what that man does in the name of progress," he said, disgust evident in his tone. "Seen him order women shot for refusing to translate children used as leverage to make their parents cooperate. Not the kind of orders a decent man follows once he understands what he's part of." The raw honesty in his words rang true, matching details Nara had shared about the attack on her village. Still, caution demanded verification rather than immediate trust. "The village," Ethan said, glancing at Nara. "What was its name?" "They called it Tsek Andishchi," Reed replied without hesitation, using the Apache pronunciation with careful respect. "Means red rock standing up, named for the formation at the canyon's entrance." Nara's sharp intake of breath confirmed the accuracy of his answer. Her eyes, when they met Ethan's, held cautious hope rather than continued suspicion. "He no place," she said quietly. "True name not what white men call it." It was a small validation, but a significant one. Anyone working with Harrington would likely know only the anglicized name the doctor used in his notes, not the Apache designation that would have been meaningful to the people who lived there. "Come closer," Ethan invited, lowering his revolver slightly, though not holstering it. Slowly, Reed approached with the careful movements of a man accustomed to potentially volatile situations, stopping some 10 feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to avoid appearing threatening. "The woman needs medical attention," he observed, his experienced gaze assessing Nara's condition. "Infections advanced, fever high." "I'm aware," Ethan replied tersely. "What exactly are you offering Sergeant Reed?" "A way out," Reed answered simply. "I know these mountains better than Harrington's city-bred trackers. Know a path that leads west from here, cuts through a high pass, then drops down toward a valley the local tribes consider sacred." His eyes moved to Nara. "I believe it's the place she's been trying to reach." The statement struck Ethan with the force of revelation. Reed wasn't just offering escape. He was offering direction to the very sanctuary Nara had mentioned, the Valley of Healing Waters, impossibly distant, by her reckoning, yet apparently accessible through routes only a seasoned mountain man would know. "How far?" he asked, hope warring with skepticism. "Day's journey under normal conditions," Reed replied honestly. "Longer with her injured, but possible." He glanced back down the path. "Better than your current prospects, at any rate. Harrington has men positioned throughout the main pass. He's expecting you to head east toward Blackwater. Won't be looking west." The logic was sound, the opportunity more than they could have hoped for just minutes earlier. Yet years of survival had taught Ethan the danger of trust given too quickly, too completely. "Why help us?" he demanded. "What's your stake in this?" Reed's weathered face shifted, something haunted entering his eyes. "Been following orders too long without questioning them," he said quietly. "Did things during the campaigns I can't undo, can't make right. But this," he gestured to Nara. "Maybe this I can balance somewhat. Help one to make up for harming many." It was a soldier's reckoning, the accounting that comes when war's immediacy fades and the moral weight of actions taken remains. Ethan recognized it from his own sleepless nights, his own ghosts that wouldn't rest easily. "If you're genuine," he said, Then taking us to this valley would put you directly against Harrington, a man with resources and connections in the territorial government. There would be consequences. Reed's expression hardened with quiet resolution. Already crossed that line when I deserted instead of following his orders at the village, he said. May as well make the desertion count for something. Ethan looked to Nara, who had been listening intently, despite her weakened condition. What do you think? He asked, respecting her judgment, even perhaps especially in her vulnerable state. She studied Reed for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting an assessment that went beyond the physical, the kind of seeing that had recognized something worth saving in Ethan when he'd been ready to turn her away that first night. He speak truth, she said finally. Eyes honest. And, she gestured weakly to their surroundings, what choice have... It was the practical wisdom that had kept her alive through horrors that would have broken many. With Harrington's men closing in her condition, deteriorating, and winter tightening its grip on the mountains, even a questionable ally offered better odds than continued flight alone. All right, Ethan decided, lead us to this valley. But understand, his voice hardened, if this is some kind of trick, if you're leading us into a trap, I'll kill you before Harrington's men have a chance to fire a single shot. Reed nodded, accepting the terms without offense. Fair enough, he agreed. But we need to move now. Harrington's not a man who gives up easy, especially when he's close to what he wants. With Reed retrieving his rifle and leading the way, they began their journey westward, following a path so faint that Ethan would have missed it entirely without guidance. The route climbed steeply at first, taking them above the tree line where wind-sculpted snow created an otherworldly landscape of white waves frozen in mid-motion. Nara's condition made progress painfully slow. Ethan carried her when the terrain allowed, but increasingly found himself needing Reed's assistance to navigate particularly difficult passages. The older man proved surprisingly strong, despite his years taking Nara's weight without complaint when necessary. His movements revealing the sure-footedness of one who had spent decades in mountain wilderness. As they climbed, the day waned toward afternoon shadows lengthening across the snow. The wind increased, carrying the bitter chill of higher elevations and the promise of another storm approaching from the northwest. If caught exposed when it arrived, even Reed's knowledge of the terrain might not save them from the killing cold of a mountain blizzard. How much further? Ethan asked during a brief rest, noting with growing concern how Nara's periods of lucidity were becoming shorter, separated by increasingly frequent intervals of fever-induced confusion. Pass is just ahead, Reed replied, gesturing to a narrow gap between towering rock formations, perhaps half a mile distant. Beyond that, the trail drops down toward the valley, but he hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky. Storm's coming faster than I expected. We won't reach the valley before it hits. Options, Ethan prompted, already calculating the dwindling possibilities. Reed considered his experienced gaze assessing both terrain and weather. Old Trapper's cabin just below the pass on the western side, he said finally. Used it myself in years past. Not much, but solid enough to wait out a blow. If we push hard, might reach it before the worst hits. It wasn't ideal. Nara needed the healing waters Reed had described, not another temporary shelter. But the alternative was being caught on exposed mountainside in a Wyoming blizzard, a death sentence no matter how determined their spirits or skilled their guide. Lead on, Ethan decided. We'll make for the cabin. They resumed their journey, pace increasing despite fatigue, as survival instinct recognized the approaching danger. The pass, when they reached it, proved narrower than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for a single person to navigate its walls, polished smooth by centuries of wind and ice. Watch your footing, Reed warned as they entered the confined space. Ice forms here even when it seems dry elsewhere. The caution proved well-founded as they picked their way carefully through the pass, each step requiring careful testing before committing weight. Halfway through, with walls of stone rising hundreds of feet on either side, Nara stirred in Ethan's arms, her first movement in nearly an hour. "Close," she murmured, her eyes opening with surprising clarity, despite the fever that burned through her. "Feel it." "The cabin?" Ethan asked, assuming she referred to their immediate destination. She shook her head weakly. "Waters," she corrected. "Sacred place. Close now." Reed, leading the way, glanced back at her words. "She's right," he confirmed. "Valley's not far beyond the pass, maybe 3 miles as the crow flies. But with the storm—" He gestured to the western sky, now visibly darkening, as clouds built into towering thunderheads. "We'd never make it before visibility drops to nothing." Frustration surged through Ethan, so close to the sanctuary Nara needed, yet still separated by obstacles that might prove insurmountable in her weakened condition. The infection was advancing rapidly, now her body's resources depleted by days of flight, cold, and inadequate nourishment. Without proper treatment, soon, not even the miraculous waters she described might be enough. They exited the pass just as the first snow began to fall, light flakes dancing in the strengthening wind, harbingers of the serious storm approaching. Below them, the western slope fell away in a series of steep switchbacks, disappearing into forests that stretched toward distant lowlands only partially visible through gathering clouds. "There," Reed said, pointing to a dark shape nestled against the mountainside, perhaps half a mile below their position. "The cabin. If we hurry, we'll reach it before the worst hits." They descended as rapidly as safety allowed, the trail becoming increasingly treacherous as fresh snow accumulated on already difficult terrain. Ethan felt Nara growing heavier in his arms, not from actual weight, but from the deadening of her muscles, as consciousness faded her body, focusing, diminishing resources on core survival rather than peripheral awareness. "Stay with me," he murmured the words, part encouragement, part plea. "We're almost there, just a little longer." Whether she heard or not, he couldn't tell. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow but regular, the rhythm of someone retreated deep within themselves, present in body, but absent in spirit. The storm intensified as they neared the cabin, snow now falling heavily, driven by wind that cut through clothing with icy precision. By the time they reached the small structure, visibility had dropped to mere yards, the world beyond reduced to swirling white, punctuated by the dark shapes of nearby pines. "Inside quickly," Reed urged, forcing the cabin's frozen door open with a shoulder thrust that spoke of familiar practice. The interior was sparse but dry, a single room containing a crude stone fireplace, a wooden platform that had served as a bed, and little else. Ancient soot stained the walls near the hearth, evidence of years of occupation by various mountain men seeking temporary shelter from wilderness and weather. Reed immediately set about building a fire, his movements efficient, despite cold, numbed fingers. Ethan laid Nara carefully on the bed platform, checking her pulse and finding it rapid but weaker than before, her body's systems beginning to falter as infection overwhelmed natural defenses. "How is she?" Reed asked, as flames caught and grew in the fireplace, pushing back the cabin's penetrating chill. "Better here," Ethan replied, simply, no purpose served by euphemism. "The infection's reaching her bloodstream, without proper treatment." He didn't finish the thought, its conclusion too painful to voice aloud. Reed nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken prognosis. "Once the fire's established, I'll check outside for pine resin," he offered. "Makes a decent poultice for infected wounds, might buy her some time." "Thank you." Ethan said, genuine gratitude in his voice, despite the knowledge that such remedies would likely prove inadequate against an infection this advanced. Still, any delay of the inevitable provided opportunity for circumstances to change, for unexpected salvation to manifest. As Reed worked to build up the fire, Ethan tended Nara with what limited supplies remained in his pack. The wound in her side looked worse than it had that morning, the tissue around it inflamed and hot to the touch. Thin red lines beginning to trace outward beneath her skin, marking the infection's spread through her circulatory system. Cold, she whispered the word barely audible despite the cabin's quiet. So cold now. The symptom was particularly concerning. Her skin burned with fever while she experienced subjective coldness, evidence of her body's thermal regulation beginning to fail. Ethan removed his coat, despite the cabin's lingering chill, wrapping it around her shoulders and tucking it carefully against her sides. "The fire's growing stronger," he assured her, though he wasn't certain she could hear or understand. "You'll be warm soon." Her eyes opened fractionally, focusing on his face with visible effort. "Not Reach Valley," she said, the words surprising in their clarity given her condition. "Not in time." "Don't say that," Ethan countered, unwilling to accept the assessment despite its probable accuracy. "The storm might pass quickly. By morning, no morning for me," Nara interrupted, her direct gaze belying her physical weakness. "No feeling. Body failing." Her hand moved from beneath the coat, finding his with unexpected strength. "Not afraid. Just sorry." "Sorry for what?" Ethan asked, his throat tight with emotion he'd thought long buried beneath years of deliberate detachment. "For not show you Valley," she replied simply. "Waters would heal more than body. Heal spirit, too." Her fingers tightened fractionally around his. "You need that. After war, after Thomas." The insight struck Ethan deeply, that even now, facing her own mortality, she thought of his healing rather than her survival. It revealed a generosity of spirit that transcended cultural differences, that made mockery of the artificial boundaries he had once accepted as immutable truth. "We'll get there together," he insisted, refusing to accept the alternative she presented. "Just hold on until morning, please." A small smile touched her lips, gentle, almost indulgent, as if she were humoring a child's innocent belief in impossibilities. "Take book," she said, releasing his hand to touch the medicine text still secured against her body. "Return to my people. Tell what happened, so knowledge not lost." Before Ethan could respond, Reed approached from the fireplace carrying a small pot of melted snow. "Fire's established," he reported, setting the water within Nara's reach. "I'll check outside for that pine resin now. Back shortly." As the older man slipped out into the gathering storm, Ethan turned his full attention back to Nara. Her brief period of lucidity seemed to be fading, her eyes growing unfocused as fever reclaimed ground temporarily yielded to determination. "Stay with me," he urged, taking her hand again. "Just until morning. Reed knows these mountains. He'll get us to the valley once the storm passes." Nara's gaze drifted to the cabin's small window, where snow now blew horizontal on howling wind. "Bad storm," she observed distantly. "Many days, maybe." The assessment matched Ethan's own reading of the weather, not a passing squall, but a serious mountain blizzard, the kind that could last days rather than hours. If Nara was correct about her condition, she would not survive to see its end. A crushing sense of futility threatened to overwhelm him. After everything they had endured, the desperate flight from his burning cabin, the battles with Harrington's men, the mountain crossing in bitter cold, To fail now, with sanctuary tantalizingly close, yet unreachable, seemed a particularly cruel twist of fate. "There has to be a way," he said as much to himself as to Nara. "Some way to reach the waters even through the storm." "No way," Nara replied, her voice fading as strength ebbed. "Accept what comes, Ethan. All we can do." The simple resignation in her words, not fearful but realistic, reflected a worldview fundamentally different from the one in which Ethan had been raised. Where his medical training had taught him to fight death at all costs, to view surrender as failure. Her people's wisdom apparently encompassed acceptance of natural cycles, including life's inevitable end. Yet something in him rebelled against that acceptance, not just for Nara's sake, but for his own. In the days since she had staggered bleeding onto his doorstep, something had awakened in him that he had thought permanently deadened by war and loss. To lose that newfound capacity for connection, for caring beyond mere survival, seemed an amputation of spirit he could not bear to contemplate. The cabin door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and bitter wind as Reed returned. The older man stomped snow from his boots, closing the door firmly against the storm before crossing to the fire. In his hands he carried a sticky mass of amber resin gathered from pine trees near the cabin. "Got enough for a decent poultice," he reported, working the resin near the fire to make it more pliable. "Won't cure what ails her, but might ease the pain some." "Thank you," Ethan said, accepting the offering with genuine gratitude, despite knowing its inadequacy against the systemic infection now coursing through Nara's veins. As he applied the warm resin to her wound, Nara roused slightly, her eyes focusing on Reed with surprising sharpness. "Valley map," she said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been for hours. "You know," Reed hesitated, glancing at Ethan before answering. "I've never been to the waters themselves," he admitted. "Just heard stories from traders, from tribal scouts, willing to speak to a white man who showed respect." He paused, then continued with careful precision. "But I know the valley's general location. Could find it, weather permitting." "Show Ethan," Nara insisted, a new urgency entering her voice. "After storm. He take book there. Complete journey." Reed nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of what she asked. "I will," he promised. "Have my word on it." Satisfied, Nara turned her attention back to Ethan, who had finished applying the resin poultice and now sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on her arm, the contact as much for his comfort as for hers. "Ethan," she said softly, her gaze holding his with surprising intensity given her weakened state. "When Reach Valley use waters for self too, not just body healing, spirit healing." Her fingers found his surprisingly warm, despite her earlier complaints of cold. "Promise." The request laid bare the depth of her perception. She had recognized in him wounds that went beyond the physical injuries of spirit, that had festered far longer than the bullet graze in her side. That she would use her final lucid moments to secure his healing, rather than rail against her own fate, spoke volumes about the person she was. "I promise," he said, his voice roughened by emotion he had long denied himself permission to feel. "But we're going together, Nara. Just hold on until morning." She smiled faintly, neither agreeing nor contradicting his determined assertion. "Good man, Ethan Caldwell," she said instead. "Better man than war try make you. Remember that. After." Her eyes drifted closed, then, consciousness yielding to the combined effects of fever exhaustion and the laudanum Ethan had administered earlier to ease her pain. Her breathing remained steady but shallow, her pulse rapid beneath his fingertips, as her body fought a battle it was ill-equipped to win. Outside, the storm reached full fury, wind shrieking around the cabin's corners, snow accumulating against its walls in drifts that would soon reach the window sills. Inside, fire pushed back the worst of winter's cold, creating a small circle of warmth in a wilderness grown suddenly vast and indifferent. "She's right, you know," Reed said quietly, having given Ethan a respectful interval of silence. "About you being a better man than the war tried to make you." Ethan looked up, surprised by the observation from someone who had known him less than a day. "How would you know?" He asked, no challenge in the question, just genuine curiosity. Reed's weathered face creased in a sad smile. "Because I've seen what the war made of other men," he said. "Seen them lose whatever humanity they brought to the battlefield, return as something harder, colder." He gestured to Nara's sleeping form. "Most wouldn't have helped her that first night. Wouldn't have risked everything for someone they'd been taught to view as enemy." The simple truth of the assessment struck Ethan deeply. He had spent years believing the war had changed him irrevocably, had carved away whatever capacity for compassion or connection he had once possessed. Yet his actions since Nara's arrival suggested otherwise, revealed a core self that had survived intact beneath protective layers of isolation and carefully maintained detachment. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "Almost sent her back into the cold that first night." "But you didn't," Reed pointed out. "That's the difference." Before Ethan could respond, Nara stirred beside him, a small sound escaping her throat as fever dreams claimed her deeper consciousness. He turned his attention back to her, immediately checking her pulse and finding it weaker than before, her body's resources failing as infection continued its relentless advance. "She needs those waters," he said, frustration evident in his voice as he glanced toward the window where the storm showed no signs of abating. "Not tomorrow or the next day. Now." Reed followed his gaze, his expression grim. "Can't reach the valley in this," he said, stating the obvious. "Visibility's near zero, temperature dropping by the hour. We'd freeze before making it halfway there." The assessment matched Ethan's own understanding of their situation, yet he found himself unable to accept its implications. After everything they had endured, after coming so close to the sanctuary, Nara needed to lose her now to something as mundane as infection seemed a particularly bitter failure. "There has to be something we can do," he insisted, medical training warring with the reality of their limited resources. "Some way to buy her more time until the storm passes." Reed was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the window to the fire, then back to Nara's fever-flushed face. When he spoke, his tone was cautious, as if weighing each word against potential consequences. "There might be a way," he said finally. "Not to cure her, only the waters could do that at this point. But perhaps to slow the infection's progress, give her body a fighting chance to hold out until we can reach the valley." "How?" Ethan demanded, hope flaring, despite his professional skepticism. Reed hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "During the campaigns I served with a Pawnee scout who knew something of medicine. He carried a pouch of dried mushrooms, never said where he found them, just that they grew in high country in places struck by lightning." His expression grew more uncertain. "Called them ghost medicine. Said they could slow death's approach when nothing else would." "And you've seen this work?" Ethan asked, medical training automatically questioning such claims. "Once," Reed confirmed. "Young lieutenant got shot during a skirmish. Too far from any surgeon wound already festering. By all rights, should have died within hours." He paused, remembering. "Scout made a tea from those mushrooms, got the boy to drink it. Lieutenant lasted 3 days, long enough for us to reach the fort for his family to say goodbye." He shrugged slightly. Not a cure, but a reprieve. In any other circumstance, Ethan might have dismissed such an account as frontier superstition, but Nara's deteriorating condition left little room for professional skepticism. Any chance, however slim, seemed preferable to passive acceptance of what increasingly appeared inevitable. "Do you have any of these mushrooms?" he asked, focusing on practical possibility rather than scientific plausibility. Reed shook his head. "Not carrying them," he admitted, "but I know what they look like, and I've seen them growing near lightning-struck trees in these mountains." He gestured to the storm raging outside, "including not far from this cabin, if memory serves." The implication was clear and concerning. Finding such fungi would require venturing out into a blizzard that could kill an experienced mountaineer within minutes if he became disoriented or lost his way. "It's suicide to go out in that," Ethan observed, though even as he spoke he found himself calculating the risk against Nara's rapidly diminishing chances. "Probably," Reed agreed with the fatalism of a man who had faced death too often to fear it unduly. "But staying here means watching her die, for certain." He met Ethan's gaze directly. "I owe her people a debt that can't be fully paid. This might be the closest I'll come." The offer humbled Ethan. This man, who barely knew them, was willing to risk his life on the slimmest chance of helping Nara survive, until they could reach the healing waters. It spoke to a depth of conscience, of personal honor, that transcended the uniform Reed had once worn, or the orders he had followed before finding his moral limits. "I can't ask you to do that," Ethan said, though hope and desperation warred within him at the possibility Reed offered. "Not asking," Reed replied simply. "Offering." He stood moving to retrieve his coat from where it hung near the fire. "I know these mountains better than most. Know how to avoid getting lost even in a whiteout." He shrugged into the heavy garment, checking that it was securely fastened against the cold that awaited outside. "And I've lived a full life already. If this is how it ends, there are worse ways to go." Before Ethan could object further, Reed had gathered his minimal supplies, a small knife, a pouch for carrying whatever he might find a length of rope, to serve as guideline back to the cabin. With quick efficiency, he secured one end of the rope to the cabin's door handle, the other around his waist. "Keep the fire strong," he instructed, his hand on the door latch. "If I'm not back within 2 hours, assume I won't be returning." He glanced at Nara's unconscious form. "And if that happens when the storm breaks, get her to the valley if she's still breathing. The waters might yet work their miracle, even if these mushrooms cannot be found." With those words, he pulled the door open, admitting a blast of frigid air and swirling snow before stepping out into the howling darkness of the mountain night. The door closed behind him with a finality that left Ethan momentarily motionless, stunned by the simple courage of a man who had been stranger mere hours earlier, yet now risked everything on their behalf. Returning to Nara's side, Ethan found her condition unchanged, fever still burning through her weakened body, pulse thread but persistent breathing, shallow yet regular. Whatever battle raged within her continued, her spirit not yet yielding, despite her body's failing resources. "Hold on," he murmured, dampening a cloth in melted snow and placing it gently on her forehead. "Just a little longer. Help is coming." Whether she heard or understood, he couldn't tell. Her features remained composed in unconsciousness, revealing nothing of whatever dreams or delirium claimed her deeper mind. Yet something in her continued breathing and the stubborn persistence of her heart's rhythm suggested a will to survive that transcended physical limitations. Outside, the storm's fury increased, wind shrieking around the cabin's corners with almost sentient malevolence. Inside, fire pushed back the darkness, creating a small island of warmth and light against wilderness grown suddenly vast and hostile. Ethan maintained his vigil beside Nara, monitoring her condition with the practiced attention of his medical training, while counting minutes with growing concern. 1 hour passed, then 90 minutes. Reed still absent, the storm showing no signs of abating. Nara's life continuing its gradual but inexorable ebb. As the 2-hour mark approached the limit Reed himself had set before, presuming him lost, Ethan found himself confronting yet another imminent loss, another failure to protect someone who had come to matter more than he had believed possible after years of deliberate isolation. The storm's howl had become almost hypnotic in its constancy when a sudden change in pitch drew Ethan's attention to the door. Something moved against it from outside, not the random pressure of wind-driven snow, but deliberate force applied by human hands. He rose quickly, crossing to the entrance and pulling it open to reveal Reed, snow-covered, visibly exhausted, but incredibly, impossibly alive, despite the killing conditions outside. The older man staggered into the cabin, bringing with him a blast of Arctic air and the unmistakable aroma of wilderness pine resin, snow, and something else, something earthy and ancient that seemed to cling to his frost-rimed clothing. "Found them!" Reed gasped, his voice hoarse from cold and exertion as he extended a small pouch toward Ethan. "Growing just where I remembered lightning-struck pine about quarter-mile west." He sank onto the cabin's sole chair, trembling with cold and fatigue. "Not many, but might be enough." Ethan opened the pouch to reveal several small mushrooms nondescript in appearance, grayish-brown, with slender stems and caps no larger than a man's thumbnail. Nothing in their ordinary appearance suggested extraordinary properties, yet Reed had risked his life to obtain them, guided by belief in their efficacy that transcended scientific skepticism. "How are they prepared?" Ethan asked, medical training automatically deferring to experience in areas beyond his knowledge. "Crushed and steeped in hot water," Reed replied, still working to regain normal breathing after his ordeal in the storm. "Bitter as hell, need to get her to drink it all, even unconscious." Working quickly, Ethan followed these instructions, crushing the small fungi and adding them to water heated near the fire. The resulting liquid was indeed bitter, the aroma alone sharp enough to make his eyes water slightly as he brought the crude cup to Nara's lips. "Help me raise her head," he instructed Reed, who had recovered enough to assist despite lingering exhaustion from his expedition. Together, they managed to get most of the liquid into Nara, supporting her head and coaxing her to swallow even in her unconscious state. Whether placebo or genuine medicine, the mushroom tea represented their only hope of extending her life until the storm broke and the healing waters Reed had described might be reached. "Now we wait," Reed said, settling back in his chair near the fire. "See if ghost medicine lives up to its name." Outside, the blizzard continued, unabated snow piling against the cabin in drifts that would soon reach the eaves. Inside, 3 people, brought together by circumstance, united by purpose that transcended their disparate backgrounds, maintained a vigil against approaching death, each contributing what they could to its delay, if not its defeat. As night deepened toward midnight, Ethan found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led him to this moment, from respected medical student to battle-hardened soldier, from isolated hermit to desperate fugitive, and now to this cabin high in Wyoming's mountains, fighting for the life of a woman who by all rights should have been his enemy. The journey made no sense by any rational measure, seemed more the stuff of fever dream than waking reality. Yet he recognized in its very improbability a pattern of meaning that had eluded him since Thomas's death, the recognition that connection, not isolation, defined humanity at its core. That wounds healed not through retreat from the world, but through engagement with it, painful though that engagement might sometimes be. Whether Nara lived or died, Whether they reached the healing waters or remained forever separated from their promised sanctuary, this truth would remain. And in that recognition, Ethan found, if not peace, then at least the beginning of acceptance, both of what had been lost and what might yet be found, if fate and a mysterious mushroom tea granted them the time to seek it. Outside, the wind began to ease the storm's fury, gradually yielding to the inexorable cycle of natural rhythms. Inside, fire pushed back the darkness, illuminating three figures bound by circumstance into something approaching family, each broken in their own way, each offering what strengths remained toward a shared purpose that transcended individual survival. And in that shared purpose, in that connection forged through adversity, perhaps lay the truest healing of all, not the miraculous waters of a hidden valley, but the simple recognition that no wound, however deep, need be faced entirely alone.